On June 17th, the biggest methane ship in the world set off on its maiden voyage from China bound for Europe. It's a cargo ship, it's huge, and it carries up to 9,500 cars. And to me, this sort of embodies largely the Europe-China trading relationship. It's so vast, but it also represents some of the fears that they have in Europe. You know, they worry about how many cars are going to be exported from China to Europe this year. They worry that local manufacturers in Europe aren't going to be able to compete with cheaper and more higher quality models coming from China.
50 years ago, in May 1975, China formally established diplomatic ties with the European Economic Community, the forerunner of the European Union. The South China Morning Post reported on the trade agreement in the making.
On the one hand, it will grant China most favored nation treatment for its exports to the EEC, and on the other, there will surely be a major improvement in the export of Western technology to China.
In the years that followed, trade blossomed and the economic relationship between Europe and China flourished. China's entry into the World Trade Organization in 2001 supercharged their growing ties. The complementary relationship with China as the world's factory and Europe as a high-value market quickly grew more tense. By the mid-2000s, Europe started accusing China of dumping cheap goods on the European market. It also accused Beijing of unfair competition because of government subsidies for Chinese industries.
欧盟呢，纺织品行业本身没有竞争力，欧盟应该加快产业调整结构的调整，而不应该采取贸易保护主义的措施。
The EU also complained about limited access to the Chinese market. By the 2010s, China was no longer just producing goods for Europe. Its innovations were posing a direct threat to European industries.
China remained one of the largest trade exporter towards European Union, and obviously the two sides have so much trade imbalances because the Chinese sells more to Europe and then the Europeans buy more from China. So that sense of imbalance is a structural imbalance which has persisted, I think, for a decade almost.
Despite the trade imbalance and the many years of squabbling, in May 2025, on the 50th anniversary of diplomatic ties, Brussels and Beijing exchanged glowing letters pledging deeper ties. And since US President Donald Trump had also taken office for a second time in early 2025, shaking up geopolitics, many expected the EU and China to grow closer.
Instead, both Beijing and Brussels decided to stay defiant, whether it's come to the negotiation over electric vehicles or on medical equipment, on many other items that European Union and China both launched a trade dispute against each other.
The shifting international trade landscape revived Europe's anxiety about a flood of low-cost Chinese goods into its market.
We are seeing a new China shock. As China's economy slows down, Beijing floods global markets with subsidized overcapacity that its own market cannot absorb.
She says that this is a subsidized China shock, that China is not transparent about how its state subsidies operate. She believes that this is an intentional weaponization of China's giant manufacturing economy.
This possible second China shock would be a repeat of what economists first described in 2016, when manufacturers outside China were not able to compete with a surge of imported Chinese products.
The Europeans are frustrated. You hear German companies complain about how they can't compete with China, not only in Europe, but also in third markets.
So the Chinese products, on the one hand, compete with European companies and European products within the EU market, and they also competing in the third country markets as well. So there's a sense of economic competition between the Chinese and the Europeans.
EU Chief von der Leyen has urged Europe to speed up its de-risking efforts.
So de-risking means that you're unpicking these dependencies in specific issues without decoupling, which would mean a total divorce in the relationship, which is entirely unrealistic and which is not what Europe wants. 90% or more of the trade between Europe and China is harmless.
But I think equally, China is also trying to reduce its reliance over the European market instead, and China is more keen to exploring emerging markets among developing countries. I think one word could capture the recent trade development between the two economic blocs, which is intense.
The electric vehicle sector is a prime battleground. In late 2024, the EU imposed duties on Chinese EVs, citing unfair state subsidies that allowed Chinese manufacturers to undercut European prices. In retaliation, China launched an anti-dumping investigation into EU dairy products, claiming the EU and its member states provided unfair subsidies to their dairy industries, which have negatively impacted China's domestic dairy sector. The move followed a Chinese anti-dumping investigation into EU pork imports launched in June 2024. China had earlier slapped duties on European cognac after a probe into EU brandy. China's Made in China 2025 strategic plan to upgrade its manufacturing sector through tech innovation has also pushed Chinese products up the global value chain.
I think the essence in here, as I said earlier, is that sense of China's economic upgrade. What China can produce, and that is also what European countries can produce at the same time. I think that's the essence of the economic structure challenge between China and Europe for these days.
Beijing's ambiguous ties with Moscow, meanwhile, have further strained the relationship with much of Europe for the past 3 years, ever since Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
In every European Union engagement with China these days, the top item on the agenda is Ukraine.
This was highlighted in Brussels during a July 2025 meeting between EU High Representative Kaja Kallas and Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. Wang reportedly stated China did not want Moscow to lose the war, fearing a US focus on Asia as a result. China's chokehold on rare earth exports is one of the most critical issues shaping the recent EU-China relations. China dominates the global supply, controlling over 90% of the world's processing and refining. Tensions intensified in April 2025 when China imposed licensing requirements on rare earth elements and magnets. A response to US tariffs that caught European firms in the crossfire, halting some production lines.
And this has made people in Europe sit up and realize, okay, well, we get all of these from China, virtually all of these. How did we get to this point, and how can we get out of this? Europe as a body, the European Union, is very reactive. The United States and China are much more proactive, but because Europe is a very unusual body made up of 27 different national governments, it always takes a crisis before anything can change.
On July 24, 2025, Chinese President Xi Jinping and Premier Li Qiang received European leaders and business representatives in Beijing.
面对加速演进的世界百年变局和变乱交织的国际形势，中欧领导人要再次展现远见和担当，做出符合人民期待、经得起历史检验的正确战略抉择。
The European delegation struck a positive note while pushing Beijing to take its trade concerns seriously. Von der Leyen said,
The EU will not be able to keep its markets open to Chinese exports unless Beijing takes decisive action to rebalance their trading relationship.
The next day, Chinese state media called the summit positive and constructive, but stressed that differences between the EU and China remain, citing China's new energy vehicle exports.
所谓中国产能过剩的论调，实质上是在经济全球化背景下对市场供需关系的片面认识，是为保护主义措施寻找托词。
While the EU and China sorted out some critical mineral export issues in Beijing, their trade relationship remains tense. Contrary to predictions that Trump's return would bring about closer ties between Europe and China, the economic blocs seem to be moving further apart.
I think China sees Europe in several different ways. It's an important export market, and as the United States closes down to Chinese companies, Europe is going to become more important. But it also sees it as, a political ally of the United States.
The larger picture in here is the geopolitics. Even if European Union consider China both as a partner but also competitor, I think that element of competitor has been far greater than the element of being a collaborative partner. So I think that won't change. And such a trade disputes, I would only expect more to come, but not less.